welcome to the fifth Architecture Alumni Talk Series webinar. My name is Cameron Brune. I'm the Dean and Head of School here in the University of Queensland School of Architecture. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. Before we get started with today's webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which many of us are meeting today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we jointly recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I'd like to just run through a few housekeeping points before we get started, and these are shown on your screens now. Today's session is being recorded, so you might have noticed that all attendees are muted and unable to share their video. It's just Jeff and myself. This is just to help us manage the number of people online this afternoon. After Jeff makes his presentation, we'll have a live Q&A session. So if you would like to ask Jeff a question, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and we'll go through those in that session. If you do have any technical problems during today's session, please click on the chat icon, which can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our very best to help you out. If your attendance this afternoon is part of your annual continuing professional development program, we will send you a follow-up email that will serve as a confirmation of your attendance and include some questions to ponder in documenting your attendance at this session. So I'd now like to introduce our presenter for today, Jeff Fearon. Jeff was born and educated in Auckland, New Zealand, and pursued his architectural studies in Australia. He graduated with a Bachelor of Architectural Design from the University of Queensland in 1995. Jeff is a director of Fearon Hay, and it's here that he pursues his passion for architecture, particularly the making of architecture, its assembly, its logic, its beauty, and its detail. And in Fearon Hay, Jeff found a vehicle and a partner for pursuing this passion, establishing the practice with Tim Hay in 1998. In their work, in the award-winning work of the practice, internationally, there's a focus on detail, but equally a focus on the way architecture performs in its place, whether it is in an urban context or a natural landscape. And Jeff's work seeks to understand how people move, occupy, and experience their place in architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Jeff Fearon. Good afternoon and welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you for the invitation to participate. It is good to reconnect with the UQ alumni and school. So I'm looking forward to getting through some of the presentation today, and then hearing some of the questions, and hopefully getting a discussion going on some of the things that we've been doing since leaving University of Queensland. So would you like me to start now, Cameron? I'll just get into going through the work.
Great, yep, go for it.
Right, so I'll just share screen now. And is that up for everyone to see?
Yes, I can see.
Good, thank you. Right, so I thought basically just run through a little pictorial kind of capture of some of the work, and also some of the process images, some of the process that we got to it, but really in by way of illustrating some of the things that we as a practice have been exploring since we began over 20 years ago now, and then kind of fleshing that out into how that's diversified and the things that interest us going forward for this very interesting future that we're now facing. But I thought that we would begin with just a quick kind of summary of some of the very early work that we did, and there was early on an interest in developing architecture that was incredibly connected to the landscape and dematerialized to a point we were exploring a series of spaces that really felt like they were covered outdoor spaces that could be contained from the landscape, but only marginally. And I think this is a project we did in the late 90s, one of the first ones that we did, using the concept of sort of rolling all of the sliding joinery out of the way and basically living under a covered veranda and presenting yourself to the landscape. A lot of the work that we did in these early days and that we continue to do was of course residentially focused, but also it was for landscape-based commissions for sort of beach houses and leisure-based projects, and that has diversified over the course of practice. But we continue to do a series of projects that really explored this theme. This one was also one of our early projects, but really looking at the idea of creating indoor and outdoor spaces that were sequenced from one another and also enabled you to protect an outdoor lifestyle while maintaining your connection to the landscape and your views. It sort of culminated in an early work on Great Barrier Island here in New Zealand. Really pared back sort of idea of just a roof over some spaces set on the hillside and presented to the coastal environment. Again, you can see this shot taken from the protected courtyard and development of the sort of L-shaped plan that wrapped the interior spaces around an exterior space and allowed them all to connect to one another through the operable enclosure that was able to be removed when the environment permitted. So these buildings were often set in some very beautiful landscapes, and we spent a lot of time exploring how we might site structures in these landscapes and tried to get elements that felt that they were quite carefully stitched into their surrounds. Usually there's quite a lot of consideration of how the existing contour and the contours around the buildings can be reworked on completion of the project so that the project feels like it has, I guess, in some ways always been there. That integration is very important to us. So I thought I'd then jump to a much more recent work just recently completed. And this particular project, still, as you can see, is developing that same theme. We have much more technology at our disposal, some much more sophisticated glazing systems, and probably a much more developed understanding of, I guess, materiality and sort of layering of how we explore those indoor and outdoor spaces. I think in this particular project, you'll see that this is we're still and sometimes still to this day use physical modelling to test how the structure sits against its landscape. And in this particular occasion, you'll see, I guess, there's a little bit more complexity in roof form and the idea of how the sculptural sort of presence of the building can sit against those landforms that we're asking it to reside in. And this is the reverse view looking through the courtyard. You will notice, I think, in a series of these selected images that the idea of, I guess, dematerialized glazing, screened openings, and the use of solid materials to anchor the buildings, despite their sort of their light glaze enclosure, is a recurring theme and what we enjoy working with. I think along the way we have developed different approaches to that main sort of exploration. This particular project is again just a simple glazed roof over a series of spaces, but in this case the structure is actually a tension balance cantilever. We've sunk the living room down into the concrete floor and placed sort of fireplaces and various courtyards around the spaces to get a lot more depth and I guess occupation, different types of occupation within these simple structures. glazing again is just a continuing exploration as to what might be possible. In this particular scenario, we knew that the prevailing wind would always be coming from this particular direction, and the idea of trying to explore an operable glass enclosure at that point was something that just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So this is a fixed glass enclosure towards the seaward side with the courtyard behind, but we really wanted to dematerialize that as much as possible, so the whole thing is a frameless glass windscreen to a certain degree. So a recently completed project, still in the theme of living by the beach, but in this particular one we really wanted to have a lot more richness, a lot of depth, and probably a lot more solidity to the built form and its enclosure. So, in the theme of exploring, I guess, materials, as Cameron said in his introduction, with a refined assembly and a simplicity of application, or a simplicity of appearance that probably belies the application, we have explored this particular project as it's actually a pair of simple gabled forms that sit in the dunes, actually in amongst the pine forest, which you can see on this right hand side, and use a timber rain screen both on the roof and the walls with operable timber shutters to complete the form, but introduce a layer of complexity to how the interior and exterior spaces again are read. Concrete is introduced in this particular right hand side as a series of masses that again anchor the lightness of the enclosure, and it is the balance of the weight and the fineness of these particular materials and their application is something that we are very interested in, no matter what project we are exploring. So this is actually a series of spaces you enter on the right hand side here. We usually play with the ground plane in quite a complex manner. We try to flood materials in from the outside or extend materials out from the interior, and again, I guess, configure the openings in such a way that we can remove the window frames themselves, so that you can get a sense of space, as this particular image demonstrates, which just really feels like the whole thing spans over an outdoor space as the main place that you will live. As such, a lot of clients ask us to create sort of covered outdoor rooms, and as part of these particular commissions, we I guess point to images like this and say, but your room is the outdoor room when you choose it to be. So that particular exploration was also taken into the mountains. We enjoy all landscapes of this level of kind of ruggedness and extreme isolation, and we try to create these structures again that feel like they have been integrated into the place that we have created them. Materiality down in the mountains here in New Zealand is obviously a different response to the projects that I've just shown you, and I think the sense of something growing out of the side of the hillside and stretching out into the beech forest is one that we feel is particularly well explored in this alpine project. But the interior aspirations are the same, in that you can participate or live in this space and actually feel like you are part of the treetops or the alpine landscape when you are inside the space. More recently, we have developed probably a much richer palette of materials, and we're also interested in developing the interior architecture in a way that kind of further reinforces this conceptual approach. So this is a very simple little building, just recently completed also in the mountains in the South Island of New Zealand. It's necessarily a very basic cubic form that the clients were keen to manage the scope and extent of the project. But it is, I guess, something that we've explored further in this particular scenario. We want to create a courtyard that define the spaces outside the simple cubic form and the wider landscape, to create layering of courtyard space, interior space, and then lines of sight through the layering of the space that give it a depth and a richness that perhaps just wasn't immediately obvious in the simple division of the cube. Materials are a big part of that, both interior and exterior, and getting the balance of the depth and richness of raw timber, the steel, and the softness of the fabrics, and the solid plasterwork here is something we continue to pursue, including this bespoke detailing of, this is actually a bathroom cabinet in that same project, which I guess, given one of the things that these smaller projects let you do is spend a lot more time on these particular details, and that layering is evident in the interior spaces. This is the view from the entry, looking beyond the courtyard to the building itself. Again, the use of screens and kind of, I guess, striking consistent lines around the perimeters of the project, and resolving the exterior envelope into the simplest geometry, while sort of investigating the depth of those layers we were just talking about in the interior spaces. So those particular opportunities have also led us to establish work offshore. And a couple of years ago, we established an office in Los Angeles, which has been a wonderful exploration, and most recently an incredible challenge in terms of not being able to get there. But this is a project that we are currently working on in Santa Barbara. I mean, a lot of the things that we started this conversation talking about, sort of dematerialization of the enclosure and the experiencing the landscape, is obviously very, very relevant to the west coast of the US and Californian lifestyle. So we're very excited to be exploring these things it is a different landscape, but it's a very different market, and that is something that we are learning from. I think constant challenges that push you in different directions is something that we have always enjoyed and tussled with, Tim and I, and the rest of the practice as we've developed. Very similar themes you can see developed here, but a much more rigorous understanding of structure, and also the opportunity to use some much more sophisticated, again, glazing systems to push those investigations further than we have been able to with some of the projects that I've showed you so far. Before starting the office in Los Angeles, we actually were able to work on a number of offshore projects, and one I wanted to introduce into this particular sequence is the loft we did in Manhattan, actually a long time ago now, but a client who was looking to build here in New Zealand. He's actually not an offshore New York client, but he wasn't able to build New Zealand, and said, would you come up and do the loft? And we said, absolutely. And we then ended up on a sort of 5 or 6 year journey, because his aspirations were for pursuing bespoke detailing and challenging interior strategies were wonderful. And I think here we explored hand blowing all the light fixtures, coming up with different strategies about how you might sleep in the loft and actually maintain the sense of it being a loft rather than partitioning the whole space up, and just exploring a whole lot of different materials and I guess, again, opportunities to work with artisans in this particular part of the world that we hadn't been able to work with before. The previous image showed you some interior window mullions around that sleeping space, which were all custom folded and finished with a hand waxed lead finish, which, to approach pencil lead, but it was a black graphite wax, which was just wonderful to be able to access that level of fabrication. We are working in Australia quite extensively, and I think the ability to investigate landscapes and coastal, or actually a lot of more urban spaces in Australia as well, has been a great extension of some of the things that we have enjoyed developing since we began. This is a conceptual image we generated for a house overlooking the harbour in Sydney, and the sort of pursuit of this particular project was to sheath the spaces in a series of onyx planes, all floating over the top of the floor planes and exterior terraces as they descend down towards the harbour. And this it's only just finished in the last couple of weeks, so we can't wait to be able to get over and actually see it now that the clients are in there. But this is a shot taken from inside one of those onyx planes as it's come into reality. The offshore work is also has been taken a little further afield. We were approached by a client to see what we might do for a translation of a half-demolished building in Taichung, Taiwan, for repurposing of a hotel. And I think this is the theme that I want to, having sort of explored the whole coastal and residential alpine body of work, I want to start discussing and opening for discussion some of this type of work, which we particularly love. The building was literally half demolished, and the concept was to actually embrace that state of the structure, develop an inhabitation of these very fine and sort of lush rooms and spaces that could be placed in and amongst the deconstructed original building, and just embrace that for its for that contrast and beauty that created. You can see this part of the building as it's found on the left hand side, and then this is a snap taken from just before it opened, I think, of the inhabitation of that atrium and the rooms that surround it. And I think this particular theme is one that we can continue to discuss. We have dabbled in some hospitality, and we do enjoy doing really beautiful bespoke fit outs. This is one that we did in an old concrete industrial warehouse. There will be a theme about old concrete industrial warehouses, but we have, in this particular case, layered the very tall space and quite raw space with hand blown light fixtures, booths created with full height fine curtaining, and these custom circular booth furniture setting, dining settings, which we at that point were all doing from scratch. So I think we started this in 2006 was the sort of vintage of this project. Clooney restaurant unfortunately closed just last year after 13 years of operation, but we were amazed that they persisted, and the room still felt like this after 13 years, so it stood the test of time. This is a drawing that I wanted to include of a project that we went on a long journey on with a client on. This is the Imperial project, which is a series of 3 heritage buildings in downtown Auckland. And the brief was really just to try and unlock the commercial space that sat within it, because it was actually a very confused address and about 4,000 square metres of commercial space that they hadn't been able to lease. And so we came up with the idea that this particular project could form an urban connection, one that not only kind of had, I guess, architectural interventions. These are some light shafts that that we're sort of sketching in these sections here, that bring light down into this new lane that we created that connected Fort Lane, which was sort of at that point a blank wall with no address, through to the main street of Auckland, Queen Street. And along the way, connected to a number of staircases that took you up and into the building. This is a photo of the completed project. So this lintel was installed, and this whole wall was just a blank brick wall. And we punched this lane through. Had to talk the client into a ramped and angled space for a hospitality activation. But it is the sense of sort of occupied and active urban spaces that have been threaded into the fabric of the existing buildings that I think we have explored repeatedly in a number of projects. This is the building I'm sitting in today, and this was, I guess, something that became a result of that in the development of the practice, which in the pursuit of trying to find a building that we could buy to be our own, to put our offices in, we ended up finding these particular buildings and further developing that idea of reoccupying existing light industrial structures, turning them into active precincts, not just the spaces within. But in this particular case, we wanted to make sure that we could sleeve the front of the warehouses with some smaller retail pockets, which is now kind of like quite a vibrant street scene outside our office. So that kind of agenda beyond the architectural project is something that we're now very interested in. There's another little project here, which is a is a similar approach in a different scheme, but just 3 warehouses. These were all covered in 1980s office buildings all the way out to these streets here. So this was more a project of demolition and reveal and new skin rather than architectural repurposing. There has been a development of a commercial body of work, which we are very proud of and very keen to pursue further. The residential side of our practice will always be a mainstay of the things that we are passionate about and the type of work that we pursue. But the idea of developing spaces for people to work in, buildings that play a role in the urban landscape and built environment, and understanding how those can contribute to the precincts that they sit in is a big passion of ours. This particular one is a new commercial build next to and keyed into a heritage building here in Auckland, and they share a circulation core which weaves between them. It's called the Kauri Timber Building, and the language for the new build was derived from the idea of the kauri logs that used to sit in the harbour across the street from this building, and the people occupying, the merchants here in the late 19th century would sit in this building and count the money as those native logs were all split up and sold off. So we thought we'd celebrate that particular idea, literally turning the logs into gold, which is a little bit over the top, but I think we pushed hard to get that concept across. And it was a simple idea of a screened office plate. It's a very tricky floor plate, but a very strong street presence. That this particular facade is on the main entry into the CBD from the west, and as such has a very loud and very busy kind of street environment to look out to. So the idea of these perforated screens and becoming the exterior presence of the building was something we developed with a lot of prototyping and help from a very skillful facade engineer. And this facade behind here has actually become is now a successful operable glazed facade for natural ventilation when appropriate. This is a couple of shots taken from a nearly completed project which we hope to have unveiled and occupied very soon. a 1960s 8-story commercial building in central Auckland, with an amazing past, about a 4.2 metre floor in the concrete structure. But it just used light well and atrium, which we have uncovered and turned into the centerpiece of all these commercial spaces that surround it, with a new flush glazed enclosure, and this now brings top light right down through into the common spaces and hospitality tenancies at the base of the building. So that was a very quick run through the practice over the last 20 years. I just wanted to finish off before opening for some questions and discussion with a little a few images from a public project that we completed a few years ago, and I guess it's a good one to discuss because it is a project that has a huge public agenda. It's a new chapel for the Auckland Cathedral, Anglican Cathedral here in Parnell. This is a photo of the cathedral under construction. This is our site where we were invited to participate in a competition for the construction of a new chapel. And this little structure is not here anymore. There's actually a beautiful timber Gothic church, St. Mary's, which sits next to the structure. It was moved onto the site recently, more recently, and it's a hugely complex environment given the kind of classic take on the Northern Hemisphere Gothic cathedral, the old timber Gothic, and now contemporary chapel asked to participate in this space here. This is a photo of the completed work, where I think the biggest thing that we were looking to do here is create a building that felt that it could bring the eclectic structures and open spaces and the beautiful oaks that you can see reflected in these windows here, so that the whole space felt like it became part of the garden. It was an aspirational concept, and one that we said was very simply described as just create a canopy over the top of this garden and the space between the structures to enable them to come together. A little harder to create, and it was an amazing journey with the project team, including some of the people that the clients themselves, who were just absolutely committed to the original concept, which was as loosely described as this pretty raw image that you can see here, and they totally bought into it and allowed us to pursue the resolution of it right through to almost every aspect of the original idea. This is how we described it to them, which is really just to stretch a canopy over the space and allow the lawn and the garden to flow in through a series of terraces to meet the unfinished ends of the ambulatories on either side of the nave, and to also touch the building very lightly against the height of the main nave, and let the angle of St. Mary's that sits here beside it and the crenellations of these dormer windows present almost an elevation to the chapel, so that it's actually the perimeters of the site that create your experience of worshipping in the space, including actually putting a strong focus in the garden itself as the centerpiece that draws you out beyond the space itself. Working with some artisans to realize the gilding. The gold leaf ceiling was, as you saw in those early images, an idea of, literally it started as an idea of just taking something as rich as the Byzantine mosaics, or something that had a sense of depth and character and material delight to it, that allowed us to use so much glass in the remainder of the space, and that has been carried through. This is all Carolina here. She runs an art restoration of artworks studio here in Auckland, and her team did an amazing work over a 3-month period to apply that gold leaf. This is I just shared some images from inside the space. That end glazing all retracts back away, and you'll recognise the early the aspirations of the early work here, also in our public work. The idea of dematerialising the enclosure and bringing the space into the room, the landscape into the room, but also working with a fineness and a very clear idea of how we wanted the existing structure to relate to the new elements, and how carefully it can touch or not touch it. Here's a shot from the garden with the 100-year the sort of heritage oak trees, looking with the windows retracted, wider terraces, and just folding these up to create the space that the canopy stretched over. And then I guess this is one of the shots that we had been thinking about, but as a big one of my favorite parts of the project is looking from the existing ambulatories out through the enclosure and entry into the chapel, and then beyond over the terrace into the garden. And that's the completed project with the windows closed. And I think that's the end of my slides. So thank you very much for hearing me through that incredibly quick run through a whole series of our projects and imagery from. I'd love to answer any questions or discussion on those.
Right. Thanks, Jeff. That was fantastic. Can I just remind everyone to type their questions into the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen? But I'm going to start, if that's okay, Jeff.
Please.
I'm fascinated to know a little bit about what happened between 1995 and 1998, if I could take you back. That period after you finished your studies here at UQ, and in a very short time established the practice, which is you've demonstrated today, a practice with an extraordinary body of work across scales and locations and type. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But, I think for many students, in their final year or in their final years of study are thinking about what happens next. One of the things we've been doing in these sessions is having a discussion around those early years post graduation. You obviously had quite a deal of determination. Can you tell us what happened?
Sure. I mean, part of it was about the fact that I didn't know whether I was going to stay in Australia or return to New Zealand, and I think one of the things that convinced me of that was actually some time spent here halfway through the degree that that year out after third year gave me the opportunity to do, and I fell back in love with the New Zealand landscape and some of the opportunities that were happening here. So that was one driver, was that I did think that there would be an opportunity to work in this landscape that we have been able to explore. Not that I wouldn't love to work in several Australian landscapes, but the opportunity seemed more direct to me at that time to be able to establish work here. I was always focused on the idea of creating a practice, but probably not so early as we ended up doing, and that I can thank my business partner Tim Hay for. We ended up working together for 1 year in the same practice here in Auckland, which is Andrew Patterson's practice, who we have a huge amount of respect for as a designer, but it would be fair to say it was a challenging work environment, and Tim was very keen to start something very quickly. So we established the idea that we might be able to work together, did a couple of competitions to test how the design relationship was going to work, and then as that was taking shape, I think as sometimes these things happen, both of us got the opportunity of some private work at the same time that wasn't going to be able to be pursued in our current employment. So that really made the decision for us that we could join forces and undertake these projects at the ripe old age of 26 or something. I think naivety is a big part of that. If you asked me to do the same thing now, I'm not sure what my response would be. But it was an amazing opportunity to just act in that moment and just jump in and then start to explore the journey that I've just run through.
So Jeff, you and Tim in your mid-20s when you started the practice?
Yes.
And
I'm
so
slightly older by 1 year.
Had you both managed to get registered in that period working for Andrew?
I quickly got registered at the end of that year, and then so we were able to establish the practice, and then Tim quickly followed. So yes, it was literally just within months.
And very quickly. So what were in that first year, what did you work on?
Certainly that first project I showed you, which is the Coromandel Beach House, the black weatherboards amongst the pine trees. That was one of the first commissions that we had, and the one that followed that, which was just the night shot with the of the roof over the series of spaces, was the second one that came very close after that. There was actually one project that happened before that, which really probably, because that was an immediate get this design, get it built, and that probably got us on our feet quite nicely, for us just sitting there and doing all the hand drawings ourselves and I guess establishing the practice on that basis, while some of these other ones took a little while to get moving. But it was definitely a very lo-fi operation.
Well, lo-fi, but also incredibly brave in many respects.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions to ask you that have come up. Sandra Parker says, hi Jeff, I love seeing what you've been doing since we graduated in '95. With so much bespoke detailing in your projects, and I guess this particularly relates to some of the work in New York, how do you manage the construction stage of your offshore projects from a base in New Zealand?
Yes, well, that's a great challenge. I think it's a great challenge not just for the offshore, but for a lot of the projects, because even though we actually don't have that many projects in Auckland, a lot of the projects that are out of Auckland, and we for the offshore projects, not just the construction, but actually through the documentation and consenting compliance phases, we always partner with a local architect. And we do an architect of record relationship with them, but we are still very involved in the realization of the construction detail through that period.
Kelly Greenock says, beautiful work, Jeff. Lovely to see the themes develop over time in your practice. You talked a lot about landscape. What would you say to young architects and to our students who don't know much about landscape design, or plants for that matter, but would like to know more? How did you learn so much about the landscape?
First of all, I declare I'm not very good on plants, but we are very focused on the landscape as an understanding of our site. And I think probably we are only really happy when the architecture almost feels second place or second string to what the landscape is doing. I think if the architecture is primarily about landing some sort of reasonably exuberant or strongly architectural focused solution that doesn't consider the landscape, that would be it's an opportunity missed, I think. So we spend a lot of time analysing landform, analysing the environmental influences, and actually discarding design solutions that we thought initially could be really exciting and a great opportunity, if they suddenly don't feel like they have a synergy with the place in which they are hoping to reside. Yeah.
So, Jeff, I want to ask you a question about being perhaps the only, or being a director of the only world-famous New Zealand-based architecture practice. You've shown us work in the USA and in Taiwan, in Australia and New Zealand today. And I think in terms of architectural practices based in the Global South, that geographic spread of projects is pretty, it's remarkable, but perhaps unique. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little on how the location of the practice and its roots in New Zealand impact on that, or have shaped that direction that you've pursued over the last 20 years.
Sure. I mean, I think on consideration of, I mean, one of the things about the opportunity of working in New Zealand is it's an incredible place to be, and with, as we've seen, some wonderful places to start to think about architecture. But it's a very, very small market, and it's a very, very distinctive sort of approach to various ways of going about doing building. So I think you always have your eyes offshore. You always have your kind of, you're thinking about what else is happening in the world. You're looking outside your shores and being really focused on trying to understand what's happening globally and how that might relate to your work, which also creates aspirations to try and participate in that. I think the other thing is that we find that even within New Zealand itself, there's a huge diversity of sites and clients. So to expand that, as soon as you start trying to work in a Manhattan loft and deliver all of that bespoke construction, and you understand how that Manhattan construction industry works, it's terrible, but it's great, right? You know, your whole brain is just completely turned on its head, and you have to completely rethink about how you're going to deliver your projects, but you come away from that with a much broader understanding of how to go about your profession.
Mm. And what skills or strategies do you think that you and Tim have made you and Tim so successful in that broadening the outlook of the practice?
Well, certainly the fact that the two of us, that there is the two of us, and that we bring a sort of like the energy of us both trying to deliver a result for the project, or the answers for the project, rather than each doing separate projects, I think brings a energy and also a rigor to what we do. And I think, you know, we've really relied on that. It's also a struggle a lot of the time. You know, we don't just hold hands and skip together down the path. So there's usually by the time a client's seen a concept, it's usually had a good amount of debate. But yeah, I think, you know, that's what underlies this whole thing, really, is that combined energy. And now the studio that we are moving into these projects with at the moment is something that we've developed really carefully over the last, you know, series of periods of time, and we now and it will continue to change, no doubt, but I think the things that we know is that we want a studio environment, that we want people who are all willing to participate in all kinds of aspects of the process, and that everyone is kind of in the ship to kind of get this thing humming along as we feel it needs to be.
Hmm. So that's an interesting aspect of your practice then. You're not two directors working on your own projects. You are two directors working on all the projects together.
Yes, absolutely. Which is, you know, I think there's a level of efficiency or inefficiency with that, but that's who we are. So that's what we embrace, and yeah, I think we've never really thought about it any other way. And it brings a very strong dynamic to the discussion of how we're going to deliver these things.
Mm. So Jeff, I have one last question, which picks up on a line that you used at the beginning of your presentation to us today, and in part it reflects the situation we all find ourselves in, whether it's in practice or in the university. And you use the phrase "this interesting future,"
Yeah.
which is I'll declare it now. I'm going to borrow it and probably use it in other places, perhaps crediting you. But I wonder, from your point of view, given the nature of your practice, I imagine that this interesting future has some particularities to it, some difficulties to it. And I wonder, as a kind of concluding question, if we could talk a little bit about what you see changing in practice as a result of the current world situation that we are experiencing.
Wow, that's
just an easy one.
Yeah. Just give me a minute. Some of the thoughts that occur to me when you ask that question is that we recognise that being together, as I said just before, being together in our studio is actually not the only way we can work, and working remotely was interesting and developed a whole lot of things, but we feed off each other, and the strength that we have as a collective studio is because of the energy that's created with us all being together and working on the different things. So that's probably become even more precious to us, and something that we will go back into and really analyse and what that might mean for development of practice into that interesting future. I do think it's really challenging to think about different places in the world, and I've sort of, listening to the current affairs and reports of what's happening every day is not the type of thing that encourages you to go out and participate in the world. It'd be very easy to think about sort of hunkering down and becoming very New Zealand centric and kind of focused here and just letting go of all of our understanding what else is happening. But I don't think that's us. I think we will find a way, and we are very fortunate to have people on the ground in the Los Angeles office that continue to do that aspect of our work. So we necessarily have kind of a connection to what's happening off there. I think project types are just going to change like hugely, and I'm not sure exactly what the new project genres are that are going to come out of this particular scenario, but I'm sure that there is going to be an aspect of work that we will be challenging ourselves within sort of 5-10 years time that is a direct result of this complete shift, and maybe the move away from the sort of it's more collective. I think it is more collective, even though it's forcing people to be more separated. I think it creates the converse. That's what I'd hope for anyway.
And so you think that could have an impact on project types like the workplace, like hospitality, etc.
And even the private commissions. A lot of the work I showed you is based on private commercial character office space. Who knows? It's certainly not viable right now, and it's who knows what version of that might eventuate the opportunity to work with existing building stock and rethink about it for rather than throwing up new office developments, or whether there's different ways and different scales or groups of people that we need to accommodate in commercial or workplace projects. I think public projects have got a huge kind of challenge in front of them in terms of how they need to respond, sort of both architectural and open space urban projects. A brief coming out from one of those projects right now should be entirely different, from what we might have seen before.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. I think in the past hour, we've had the sort of perfect combination of looking at some of the inspiring work, but also some discussion and some inquiry into the process and the future. So I think a wonderful session. So thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us and sharing those thoughts today. And thank you to everyone online who's participated in the session. We hope you've enjoyed it. This is the 5th in the series that we've been delivering over the last few weeks. So I'd encourage everyone to come along next week for the final in this series, which will be Matthew Van Coy, who's a principal at John Wardle Architects in Melbourne. And that'll be next Thursday, the 2nd of July at 5 p.m. So thank you everyone for participating today. And we look forward to seeing you all very soon. Stay safe, and thanks again, Jeff, for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thanks, everyone.